Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Trisha's got the clicker. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm always so excited to share some of the things that I make and the ways that I can work with other kind of creative thinkers. And a big part of what I'm really interested in that I'll be talking about this morning is how technology or perceived technology can bridge a gap in a conversation. Oh, thank you so much. Or allow you to try something new that maybe you thought was unattainable. So it'd be a little hard because of the sun, kind of the lovely sun coming in here and washing it out. But I wanted to start by just showing a few things about me. And so my name is Nick, and I teach at TCU. This is my 9th year, I believe, there. And I teach in the art department, and they invited me down so long ago to create new classes in emerging technologies and finding a way to fuse some of those technologies with a traditional studio practice. So I created a bunch of new classes and developed lab spaces for not just my students, but any student who's willing. I've created, with the help of several colleagues at TCU, a video game research lab that is in our library dedicated to making accessible these kind of cultural artifacts, because why should you treat a game or a narrative story any differently just because it's an electronic object? So students or anybody with a Fort Worth driver's license or address can get a library card and come check out these super rare, weird things from video game history or the newest game that you want to explore, but you just don't have the resources or the infrastructure at home to kind of have that story unfold for you. So a big part of my teaching and my artwork is trying to make accessible the things that are so important to me and the way that I solve problems or address issues that are central to the way that I think about the world. So I was invited to speak about liminal, and so what I think of liminal, or what I think of when I hear that word or when I read that word, is that transitory space, the way that it's maybe often in architecture, sometimes an afterthought. It's this space between spaces, and that something like that can toe the line or be part of a boundary seemed really appropriate to think about some of the 3D scanning, 3D modeling and animation that is part of some of the objects and the artworks that I make or the way that I teach. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about some of those techniques and show you a few images that we could use to start a conversation. On the right, it's a little hard to see, but this is a one-way tunnel that's about 7 kilometers long in Iceland that I was driving through. And so it requires this unspoken agreement or bond if you see headlights coming, where just like if you've ever gone on a street worth and there's cars parked on the side, you have to decide, am I going to pull over and wait for this car to come by? Except it's a little more intense when you're in a tunnel inside of a mountain, and there's not always a place to pull over. You might have to go in reverse for a half a kilometer to be the person that allows somebody to go past. And so to further amplify that experience, that was really wonderful, is that when you enter the tunnel, there are these huge metal doors in case of snowfall or avalanche. And so in that case, they don't want the tunnel to fill. And so you kind of go into this vault for 7.5 kilometers or so. But I thought that was a great liminal space to kind of start the conversation. And I'm more than happy, I don't know, in terms of sharing some of these with the community, but I'm more than happy to share the slideshow so you can experience all of this later, or if you miss a reference point or anything like that. So just continue our glossary, our vocabulary that I think is really important for some of the topics or the images I'll be showing. One of them is telepresence, and I thought it was really interesting that I pulled this slide from a talk I gave about 5 years ago, when this elicited a lot of like laughter of like, what? I would never have a meeting with somebody on Zoom and pretend to interact with them. And that's become this kind of real big pivot. And so, I used to explain the idea of creating empathy with a screen and having this conversation across physical boundaries. And, in the last couple of years, we've seen a big shift where that's become more commonplace in working from home and from creating a safe working environment for everyone. And so that also is a pivotal point for the idea of liminal spaces for me, and that idea of a transitory either architectural object or just in general a bridge in a conversational gap. So thinking about that, it leads me into extended realities and different realities. And so extended reality or virtual reality for me is taking kind of a trip from the early 1990s to present day. And so my first experience in seeing this kind of example on the left was something called a virtuality pod. And essentially there were about 350 of them that were produced. They cost anywhere from $40,000 to $50,000 to create. You can see this kind of clunky, large wearable object, and a basic three-dimensional space that exists to give you an experience outside or inside of your body. And it was mind-blowing to see this entry into a non-physical environment, a space that existed, but at the same time it did not exist. And just only, a few years later, right, we're seeing like virtual reality experiences bridging that barrier on late night TV shows, or you or someone may even have, devices like this at home that are designed to be portable and are designed to be these immersive experiences. The gap is still there for being a creator for those. It's still a consumer-driven marketplace for virtual reality because of the technical needs to produce for those. But that's something that I'm consistently trying to remove in my teaching and when I work with other artists, where I can introduce them to maybe a set of tools or a new way to use something they already know how to use in order to create a virtual experience. One example here is thinking about how these extended realities, these non-physical spaces can change your interaction with others and create that sense of maybe empathy, or allowing you to role play something outside of your normal day. So on the left, there's essentially an open world video game that's free to play called VR Chat, where you can embody an avatar, and there's not necessarily a combat element that you might expect in a traditional online game. You just sit around talking to other players, and maybe you're a cat, maybe you're a giant slice of pizza, maybe you're a chair or your favorite anime character or something like that. But it's a place to look a different way, and for some players, maybe that's a fun experience to be outside of your own body, but for others, it can be a way to begin a transition, begin a way to have somebody see you in a different way. And I think that's so important, that this mask can be as active or as passive as you would like it to be. And on the right, it's a little difficult to read with the light, but this is a project I worked with for a class I'm teaching in the spring again, but it is a project where I invited my students to create a video game that took us into the point of view of a small animal. And so thinking about empathy, thinking about how somebody or something that is smaller than you can have needs and explore a space and have desires and have fears. And by putting it in that perspective, can you create a sense of empathy Can you teach us something new about a creature or an animal, or take an animal that might be perceived as scary or gross and make it cuddly and wonderful? So what you see right here is we are a mountain kind of hare or rabbit exploring the natural environment. So I worked with that student to identify what flora might be in that animal's actual living spaces or habitat. We placed those in the environment. We created, rivers and streams and mountains, and then we just played this game where we were a rabbit walking around, exploring, looking for things, and deciding what our goal would be based on what we knew about that animal. Extending that, I'm really also so interested in non-visual experiences in this transitory space, this space between spaces. So I think the assumption is that if I'm creating a virtual reality or an extended reality experience, it requires two eyes. It requires hands that can move. It requires a body that is locomotive. And I don't necessarily agree with that as a default. I want everyone to be able to explore a virtual space or a space between spaces, regardless of their background or maybe perceived disabilities. So on the left is another example from that animal project where I assisted a student creating an experience, a virtual bat experience. So it's all sound. It's all virtual sound. You navigate a space just by listening. You create an auditory soundscape that, while it functions as a video game, you can play it blind. You can play it with your eyes closed, and you can listen and move and make decisions based on your ears and this layer that is ever present, but is often forgotten about in our exploration of these types of spaces. And on the right is thinking about, with non-human eyes, what does our world turn into? So this is actually the exploration of one of my students' apartments with fly vision. So we repeated the little cameras and screens in this space, and it becomes this jumble of color and shape that is so wonderful. And for a second you forget you're a tiny fly that could be swatted at any moment and is a pest. And you're just seeing these washes of colors and IKEA furniture that gets repeated, and it's a really interesting way to dramatically change your perspective, your sense of scale. And again, invite you to think about everything about physical and virtual spaces. So beyond teaching and working with some of these tools, I wanted to also show how a big interest of mine is using this outside of studio art or outside of the arts. So I work a lot with our science and engineering department at TCU, and assisting students who may be interested in pursuing psychological study or use of technology as a therapeutic element. And so I just have an example on the left here of something called mirror box therapy, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it's for often a stroke recovery or someone who has lost a limb, to help them cope with phantom pain. So it visually, without any kind of technology other than a mirror, recreates that sense of whole and allows someone suffering from maybe a phantom limb pain to temporarily or permanently recover from that. A dark video. There is a virtual reality game that came out a couple of years ago that is centered around PTSD. So it recreates visually the sensations that someone suffering from PTSD may experience. And again, this is not necessarily a tool for someone suffering from PTSD, but it's a tool for you who is not suffering from that to understand what they may be seeing, how they see the world differently from you, and allow you to make an informed series of changes or decisions about how you might interact with that person, or how you might create an environment that is safe or inclusive or less traumatic than their normal day-to-day experiences. So seeing some of the practices and the ways that technology can be implemented, I thought it would be really great to walk you through a specific project or a site in how I might address that or work with that location, just to kind of show you where the kitchen implements are and how these recipes come together. So there's a technique for capturing space and object and environment called lidar, and it's short for light detection and ranging. It's essentially, if you've ever used one of the tape measures that has like a little laser on it. So like if I went like this and it told me that was, 15 feet away. It's basically like that, except it's on a series of spinning mirrors, and it happens thousands of times a second. And then it takes all those little dots and it can create a shape or a form. And so what you see on the left here is this house. That we'll be talking about this site in a second. This is in northern Iceland. And then this is the series of dots from scanning it. And so what looks like this weird heat map that you would see from a helicopter is really just all of those little measurements adding up to create a cloud, something called a point cloud. And I scanned this from just one or two places. You can see these little shadows. That's where I was standing. And so you can see how that spinning element, it just captures a sphere of dots, and then you can line them up to kind of see how far away things are. We're reading this as a house, but it's really just dots. It's nothing. It's a virtual representation of space. And what I really love about this process is that if it's unseen, it becomes invisible. I was too short to see the top of the house, and so that means I can't measure or scan it. And so it ends up as a void, like it's a little playhouse or a playset or a dollhouse that has nothing. And you can see, where the laser might have gone through the windows and captured something. And it's a really interesting way to me of measuring space and thinking about how we define a boundary. So this is also an image here, because at the same time it's measuring how far things are through lidar. It's also capturing color, and so I can then bring that color data in and map it onto these surfaces, essentially creating a three-dimensional photograph. And it's something that does take time and is an intense process, but it can be so rewarding when I can revisit a site years or months or days, hours later in a new way. Often I've used this technique when I am traveling or moving through maybe a city or a site, and I don't necessarily have the time to sit there and do a drawing or take photos or paint a still life, right? But I can quickly scan a series of locations, throw it in my bag, and then when I get back to Fort Worth or home, I can unpack this virtual space and walk around it and look at it differently and think about it, or say, what would it look like if it was nighttime? And I'll change the sun and see how the light would impact it differently. This is kind of an example of what that house looks like. So again, what I'm so fascinated with is how our brain fills in those gaps. I thought that was also interesting in a connection to a liminal space or a transitory space. Our brain is trying to create surfaces constantly. We're filling in these gaps, the same way that if you've ever read one of those examples where they take out individual words or letters, your brain still can read it. That's the same way with this process. So I just did kind of a slow zoom in on this point cloud, and what you'll see is that the closer I get, the farther apart those little dots get. And I may be scanning something and each little dot might be an inch or a few inches or a foot apart, but when we start to pull back and think about a solid surface, our brain tends to make it flat. So it gets hard to read on a black screen. But a similar site that I thought was really central to the topic today was this eastern fjord in Iceland, where there was a shipwreck of a herring ship. So the herring industry was basically like the gold rush in this part of the world, where there were so many herring that everyone and anyone started a shipping and a fishing industry. And then, like many gold rushes and many industries, it collapsed. The fish did not show up in the 1960s. And so what you saw was abandoned fisheries, abandoned ships, and essentially an entire industry just collapsed. It was no longer profitable or sustainable. And so when I was going around and doing some hiking and some photography, I found this kind of wrecked ship. And I was really fascinated with its connection to the history of the landscape. And so I photographed it, and I took a lot of reference images, again, knowing that I couldn't necessarily make what I was thinking about on the site. So I was using the tools that were available to me to capture it as best I could, the same way that if you see something you like out in the world, you might snap a photo and look at it later or share it with someone. I was just taking a lot more photos than most people. So this is the representation of what I would see when I was 3D scanning. This is kind of straight out of the tool. And so everything just turns into those little dots. And what you actually see here on the top is because it was raining, it was starting to pour. And so with my partner that I was traveling with, I was holding this like survival blanket, one of those little gold blankets, so we could keep the equipment dry. But the laser was still scanning it because it scans three-dimensional. So we ended up with this like fun, weird ceiling on there. And can't really read it on there, but this is an image of the laser scan. And then it was used to create animations as we were kind of revisiting the site later that day, where I could say, okay, what would happen if we took this wrecked ship and we threw a bunch of logs, all this driftwood that's on the shore, and I'll animate that. And so then we just would spin it in space and throw things at it and think about it differently, as opposed to a static object that's been there for many, many, many years and is rusted and is falling apart. It becomes alive again, and it becomes explored in a new way because we have that superpower of being able to lift something and unmoor it and look at it differently. That was not satisfying enough. So then I used that file to 3D print and create a replica that I could look at and hold. And continuing that representation of the animation, I then said, well, then I need a bunch of little tiny logs. And so I would make little tiny logs and position them and make these little sculptures that tried to recreate this moment of seeing this locked in time vessel that was so at one point was needed for this industry to support your family or support a community, and now is nothing, is garbage, is trash, is left behind. And to connect to the capture of the site, I also put some little gold figures down here because we were holding that gold blanket. And so underneath this kind of small object, there's two little gold leaf ghost-looking figures. But this is very small. This is maybe only a foot or so wide, but the miniature really helps me connect with a site and a place and a virtual representation in a new way. Here's another example of that process. So you can see on the left, taking some of those landscapes, capturing with lidar, and this might be a 1 kilometer wide section of the landscape, but I'm carving it out of wood and then using it to create a form or a mold that I can then reproduce. And I use that process that is called vacuum forming, but you probably are most familiar with it in theater or costuming. So it's kind of how every stormtrooper costume is made in Star Wars. Basically where you take a positive, a form, something that is hard and is resistant to heat, and you take a heated plastic sheet and stretch it over that form to create copies or multiples really quickly. And so copies that I could then draw on top of or paint onto or cut up and manipulate. And I like the idea of taking this little hexagonal tile of the landscape, similar to maybe a board game or how we see these modular forms in terms of representing maps or other parts of our world. Taking that same I could also revisit that idea of animation. What would it look like if 1,000 colored spheres were dropped on this hillside that I was standing on? And how would they find their way down this hill? And it's fun and it's funny, but at the same time it tells me a lot about erosion and how some of those shapes or forms make. And you can see, like, there's me sitting there trying to like hold this really expensive lidar scanner from falling down a few kilometers past a waterfall. And then layering it with footage I shot that day, or with my partner on this project, thinking about how we could combine and recreate some of these spaces or ephemeral moments with these tools. This is an interior space, but at the same time, for me, it's just another way to capture an environment and to manipulate it or think about it in a different way. And maybe what I love the most about creating these types of non-physical spaces is that it's not a perfect capture. You end up with missing elements, or where the light does not penetrate, or where the laser is blocked. Just like if you shined a flashlight on a big pile of trash, it might make an interesting shadow on the wall. And does that shadow become more interesting to you than the pile of objects that's sitting there? So it becomes this interesting duality that I'm so fascinated with. But these are kind of some of the sketches that I might take from a site using these tools. And so just kind of a last slide here to kind of continue some of these conversations and circle back to the way that I can work with somebody who is interested, doesn't necessarily have that experience with the technology or access. With my students or someone who is interested at TCU, a lot of times we will take our tools or the equipment that we have available to them, or identify resources and take them to a site and show them this process and show them how they can capture a space with more than just an image or a sketch or a drawing or a plein air painting. And that can then be used to create everything from videos to animations to sounds. So this is actually over by a part of the Trinity. There's this little waterfall here. And so you can see little orange dots, and those are all my students wearing these little safety vests. But we're all kind of drawing or photographing or sitting there kind of thinking about the landscape in a new way. And then these kind of quick little 3D scans can allow us to revisit that hours, days, weeks, years later. And it can serve as a snapshot of place and become a really interesting way for me to explore space between space.